welcome everybody. What a wonderful turnout today. We really appreciate your enthusiasm and your patience while we try to make sure that everybody who wanted to come could come. So really huge welcome to all of you here today. Today is a very special day. I'm really delighted that Hito suggested that she wanted to stage a day, in a way a day of exploration around the title, as she's called it, Circulationism. And Hito herself will elaborate on what this word and this idea might mean and how we might explore it today with a series of fantastic speakers. So I'm really grateful that you suggested this idea, and I hope that this will be a really important and special exploratory day. And on that note, what we would like to do is have a short introduction by Hito to the ideas and the possibilities of today. And then we will have our first two speakers and a short break, 10 minutes. As you may know, there's lots of other things going on today. There's the opening of many things in the collection. So if the cafe is very busy, just do bear in mind the time, because we'd like to sort of start again. But we will have a 10-minute break, followed by the second two speakers. At the end of the day then, after these four sort of presentations and collections of thoughts around these ideas, we'd really like to encourage you all to participate with us, to map out this terrain, to map out a very unknowable situation as we think at the moment around the current state of affairs today. So we would just actively encourage that. We will have microphones and indeed we'd be glad to hear from all of you. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today. As I said, I'm thrilled to have people from far and wide. Firstly, David Riff. David Riff is a writer, translator, artist and curator based in Moscow and Berlin. He has written widely on history and the present of contemporary art in Russia as an art critic, contributing to Flash Art, Springerin, Moscow Art Magazine. He's translated extensively. His most recent project, a forthcoming volume of work of Soviet aesthetic philosopher Mikhail Lifshitz. Riff is also a member of the work group Что делать, What is to be done, and has been involved in other artistic collaborations such as Learning Film Group or the Karl Marx School of English Language. Recent curatorial projects have included Monday Begins on Saturday, the first edition of the Bergen Assembly, the international exhibition The Pozzi Principle in 2010-11, Shock Workers of the Mobile Image, the first edition of the Euro Industrial Biennial, and Auditorium Moscow, a discussion platform and exhibition in 2011. David also teaches at the Rodchenko School for Photography and Media Art in Moscow and is a member of the Academy of the Arts of the World in Cologne. The second speaker following from David is Josephine Bosma. Welcome, Josephine. She's a journalist and critic working in Amsterdam. She focuses on art in the context of the internet since 1993. While initially making radio shows and reports, her writing onto net art and net culture appeared in numerous magazines, books and catalogues, both on and offline, since 1996. She co-edited the NetTime book Read Me and the Next 5 Minutes workbook, and briefly edited the online newsletter Cream. In 2011, her book Netitudes, Let's Talk Net Art appeared. Since 2011, she is an external PhD candidate at the University of Amsterdam. We're also delighted to have Metahaven. Metahaven was founded by Daniel van de Velden and Vinsja Kroek. Daniel will be speaking here now. Metahaven is a research and design studio based in Amsterdam. Metahaven's work, both commissioned and self-directed, reflects political and social issues in collaboratively conceived graphic design, objects and media. In addition to international presentations of design, research and art projects, Metahaven has published numerous essays, such as the three-part Captives of the Cloud series on Eflux Journal, On Corporate Identity, a design anthology for our dystopian age, published by Lars Muller in 2010, and co-edited with Marlene Fischwitz, and the ebook Can Jokes Bring Down Governments, released by Stalka Press in 2013. The studio was awarded the Cobra Art Prize in 2013 and the Icon Design Studio of the Year award by Icon Magazine London in 2013. Hito Steyerl almost needs no introduction. I hope you've all enjoyed the incredible exhibition here today. In her own words, she states she's a filmmaker, video artist, writer, and middle-aged single mom. I would like to say your word. And a wonderful, wonderful artist, of course, we know. In addition to different solo exhibitions, her work was shown in the 2013 Venice Biennale and Istanbul Biennials, the 2010 Gwangju and Taipei Biennials, and the 2008 Shanghai Biennial, documented 12 in Kassel and Manifesto 5. She's a professor of art and multimedia at the University of Arts in Berlin. So I'd like to hand over to Hito to outline this wonderful day that I expect we'll all share today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Penny, for making this possible. Thanks also to Nick and the whole staff here at VAM for again hosting some event related to me in such a wonderful way, and thanks also to the speakers for accepting this quite short-term invitation and preparing such wonderful talks. Maybe one quick note as to the structure of the event. David will start off giving a presentation, followed by Josephine. Both will talk for 30 minutes maximum, followed by a Q&A. We will have a break, and then reconvene with Metahaven's presentation, followed by mine, and we'll have another Q&A. And as Annie already said, I'm hugely keen, to also know more about your points of view and your experiences in this field, because I think this is basically the main point of the introduction, but basically also my position to the content of this event is that basically it's impossible for anyone to know a lot about it, right? Because the whole area of this mass circulation, also user-driven circulation of data, which has accelerated so much over the past decades and is causing effects that are basically not yet understood because they happen as we speak. No, we only see basically the beginnings of the dynamics of developments which are unfolding now and which, at least from my point of view, are quite unforeseen and opaque. So in that sense, I think that in a way, the incompleteness of every point of view in giving descriptions or tentative analysis or speculation of what's going on today is the main point, and also probably, I think one of the core characteristics of this whole field is a certain kind of confusion. And to really try to condense what I want to say, and to say it in a very simple way, I sort of a joke, that my daughter, who's 9 years old, told me last week, and I thought it was hilarious, but also very wise, so I will tell it to you, and I think that this is a really beautiful way to condense the confusion about what's going on in circulation and within circulation today. So, two people meet, and one is a cowboy, and one is a native Indian, and the Native American, and they don't speak one another's language, so they communicate in sign language. And this is what they say. Now you have to watch. The Native American does this. The cowboy replies. Native American does this. And the cowboy replies. Cowboy gets home and tells his family, look, I met this really weird person today. He told me, I'm going to shoot you. And I said, I'm going to shoot you twice. And he said, I'm going to burn down your house. And I said, I'm going to flatten your country. Native American gets home and says, I met this person today and we were having a conversation. I asked him, what's your name? And he said, my name is Rabbit. Are you a mountain rabbit? I asked. No, I'm a field rabbit. So I think in a way, this really, I thought it was hilarious, but I thought also it's extremely wise because it characterizes a situation which I would describe as code without contract. So these two people are sharing basically the same code, right? But they do not have any agreement over what it means. They communicate, they are using the same symbols, if you like, but they are using them in a completely different way, and there is no understanding about what they are supposed to mean. And I think that this is one of the cause of the confusion of, circulation of data and what they mean, because everybody is understanding it in his or her or their own way. What for one people might be, a cat gift, is for the other one an invitation to spam you forever with targeted advertisement. Or for what you or me might be a selfie, is for other people a face print that will, pin down your facial features forever and will make you recognizable wherever you go. So in that sense, for every set of data, there's of course, a multitude of ways of how this could materialize, of the consequences it could have about where they're going to go, how they're going to travel, how high or how low, or what it's going to mean. And this situation of code without contract is, in my view, one of the main, let's say, dilemmas, but also challenges, which characterizes the current confusion about, what the mass circulation of data actually does and how it profoundly transforms. And we will have, great examples about this later in the individual talks, how it transforms not only daily life, but of course also global politics, how it intervenes, into a sort of new geopolitics that's emerging as we speak, where the virtual and the physical, the material and the imaginary are completely intertwined. So without further ado, I would like to invite the first speaker, who is David, to give his point of view, essentially talking about the current situation in Russia and the Ukraine and their, interlinkage with the virtual imaginary.
Thank you, Hito, for the great introduction, and thank you also Annie, Nick, and everyone else for inviting me here. I'm going to today do something I don't usually do, which is I'm going to read a text. I'm not going to speak freely. So I ask that you bear with me. It's quite dense, but it's going to be accompanied by some images. It's about the current situation in Russia. The death or end of the internet is much on everybody's mind in Russia at the moment. The first opposition sites were already blocked in the days after the Anschluss of Crimea, and soon after, Putin himself pointed out that the web is an invention of the CIA. In late April, Senator Maxim Kavjaradze, I especially practiced this, but I couldn't get it right. Senator Maxim Kavjaradze suggested setting up a new North Korean-style national intranet called Cheburashka in honor of the so popular Soviet cartoon character, causing widespread alarm. And by mid-May, a leading functionary of blacklist authority Roskomnadzor said that Twitter should and inevitably would be blocked due to the rampancy of extremist content. This is when people really got scared. And really, what would we do? Where would we go? How would we live? Zombie apocalypse. Facebook addicts telling everybody details from their lives. Pimple-faced gamers with no more bots to shoot, testing out their new water guns in the supermarket. Or maybe there would be some general awakening, where the cobwebs of dreamtime fall away, and you see that the state of exception was permanent all along, and that there was never such a thing as freedom, as convincing as the illusion was when you were dreaming. In some ways, the internet serves as a new interior, like the dreamy world theater Walter Benjamin describes in his Arcades, the safe haven where the private person arranges his or her cognitive map of a garbled totality in collector's items. For the global petite bourgeoisie of today, the equivalent of Benjamin's collectibles are clearly clips, memes, selfies, likes, and shares, temporarily arranged in a velveteen comfort zone. This essay, too, is such an arrangement. But it is far less comfortable than Walter Benjamin's interior, given not only the radical turnover speeds and life cycles of the image artifacts involved, but also the transparency and permeability of the boundary that supposedly guarantees privacy. In other words, there's nothing velveteen or opaque about the private person's world theater, except when the screen is off. Instead, we are utterly conscious of our workspace's dark transparency, and this is a term you will hear some more today. This is especially the case in Russia, where government and pro-government hackers have been working for at least a decade to thoroughly securitize and militarize the web. By now, they are capable of capturing maybe not every keystroke, but almost. And this is not paranoia. We simply know that it's true. Russia was the first country to officially introduce a more primitive and more effective version of the NSA's Project PRISM, with the so-called SORM, SORM2, and SORM3, and it's extending now to SORM4 and SORM5 devices, which record all voice and data traffic using primitive RAID arrays. So just hard disks, the kind that you use to store your data, are all hooked up to one another, and they suck up everything, and it's searchable, basically. The FSB and other services, other security services, have immediate access without requiring any court orders or any tribunals or anything like that whatsoever. It's just a Google, you type it in, and you have access. There's an openness and a flatness to the entire issue that's unbelievable. You know you're being watched, like your parents were watched, and your parents' parents were also watched. But maybe at some point, the watchers will just grow tired of watching, and shutting it down will seem like the best option. So you should be grateful for every word of dissent that they let you read under observation. Every tweet could be your last. Of course, like in Erdogan's Turkey, nobody blocked Twitter. In fact, it was the catastrophically progressive Prime Minister Medvedev who tweet-walked back the threat. Indeed, Medvedev and co. need Twitter. Vice Premier Dmitry Rogozin uses it to threaten strategic bomber attacks on Moldova or GPS shutdowns, which you may not have heard of. The Ministry of Trade and Finance then tweets back a huge what the fuck. Twitter, Facebook, and VK, in other words, are the stage upon which the apparatus performs its splits, and only Putin can arbitrate. Indeed, perhaps by clearing the stage entirely, even though he promised last night that he wouldn't. So the threat remains, with lovable Cheburashka as our Godzilla, the internet shutdown, our version of the 4-second flash of mutually assured destruction. It won't really happen. Or maybe it's happening already. Maybe preparations are already underway. The answer, of course, not only concerning the impending shutdown of the internet, but also the general authoritarian, imperialist, and some, including myself, would say fascist shift of the Putin regime, is that it is happening already, but that little has actually changed, except for an example of one house-sized propaganda graffiti mural near my house that here says, Crimea and Russia together forever, you know, BFF. So that's all that's changing. Life goes on gorgeous in the spring sun, with the internet as the primary battleground, if you don't happen to be in Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Odessa, Mariupol, and so on. That means that a radical shutdown of propaganda would indeed be the equivalent of a nuclear strike, ending all combat. It's a meat grinder of circulating images, memes, and characters that only comes up close once you turn on the internet to join the fray. But at that point, it infects everything it touches, like a worm, like a virus, like a parasite, or like a Trojan. One of the central visual memes or markers in this whole thing is a case in point. You can recognize those carried away by the general wave of patriotic sentiment by their black, orange, black ribbons of St. George, as they're called. They were invented in an internet publicity project by the responsible department head of what was then still the RIA Novosti news agency for the 60th anniversary Victory Day over fascism in 2005. The stripes quote the ribbon to which the generic, here's the internet project, you see, and the ribbon quotes the generic 1941 to 1945 campaign victory medal, but also harkens back to older Tsarist decorations. presenting a continualist genealogy reflecting the regime's fundamentally unhistorical conflation of old-school Russian imperialism with retro-Soviet imagery. Originally, it was intended as a non-political, non-commercial sign of civic commemoration, according to the 10-point charter of its inventors, which went down well in those depoliticized years of the mid-2000s. Collaboration with pro-Kremlin student movements helped the project go viral, and after about 3 tireless campaigns, President, or was he then Prime Minister Putin, and Prime Minister, or was he then President Medvedev, were both seen wearing such ribbons, giving the project further access to heavy-duty corporate and public funding. And this year alone, 100 million ribbons have been distributed, and more importantly, also worldwide. So they're really trying to bring this also to America, and maybe even in the Netherlands, you saw someone distributing such ribbons. Some crazy shit. Over the years, the symbol has shifted in meaning. Not only has it become a clear political identifier, counterposed to the white ribbons worn by the protest movement of 2011, but it has also turned into a tool for array patriotic leveraging, a non-brand distributed by loyal corporations to their employees as a micro-uniform. It can be an instant, hipster accessory or a talisman to ward off nationalist violence for Azerbaijani cabbies and Kyrgyz cleanup brigades. The ribbon of St. George, a typical historical fake, is a real-world virus of sorts, or maybe a Trojan, a warm, ubiquitous, latent, ready to strike once the command is given. But now something has changed. You know the people who continue to wear it long after May 9th are fervent supporters of the regime and its dream of Novorossiya, as they call it. Yeah? New Russia, but it's this kind of weird, folksy pronunciation, Novorossiya. People who might have worn it some years back are now much more careful lest they be misidentified as Colorados, which is as the wearers of such striped ribbons are called in Ukraine. In another reappropriative twist, because they're similar to Colorado potato bugs, the design, in another twist of a reappropriation of Cold War propaganda in the GDR, where Americans were identified with the Colorado potato beetles emanating from around their bases. So today, if you wear this kind of ribbon, everyone will know that you are a Kremlin bot. You're a robot of the Kremlin. In general, it's tempting to read the entire conflict operation turn as a live bot war. For an instance, the Crimean operation looked like a bloodless mod of a first-person squad shooter where the bots refuse to fire and stand around guarding things and combat never quite begins. What may have been the largest unmarked Black Ops campaign in history really looked like a 5th or 6th generation computer game, too, in terms of skins, weapons, physics, and rules. Even the uniforms are no longer Cold War era Soviet army, but westernized, Europeanized, technologized, by the way, with help from Rheinmetall. Apparently, this German defense contractor advised the Russian Federation military on its new lo-fi version of the IDZ-ES future soldier system. Of course, if the lo-fi future soldier kit made the unmarked Russians look like bots, the whole point of sandbox games like Arma, for an example, is that you can paint the various soldiers with textures, if you like, as do many patriotic gamers on both sides. Using them to reenact, so here's the other side. This is the right sector of the Ukraine in their uniform, their fascist uniform. Using them to reenact or predict real-world scenarios, and more importantly, to practice the communicative routines of technologized war. And here, Arma and other co-op shooters are extremely realistic, as one can see by watching gameplay videos that I won't torture you with here. These games are replete with cinematographic cutscenes involving the by now familiar imagery of roadblock newscasts, but there's also, so we see this and that. But there's also plenty of military drudgery, hours of boredom as troops head to their assembly areas, like in the real world, and hit the road on long marches that take hours to complete. And there's also plenty of sadness and grit, especially among the virtual civilians, imagined as an expropriated Eastern European post-socialist population arranged in a Brechtian enfilade, like in Sergei Popkov's famous socialist realist painting, Builders of Bratsk, paced into the misogynist crosshairs and torn by the realistic, if schematic, ideological contradictions of the day. If you are looking at Russian sites, the scenarios inevitably end with the unconditional victory of little green men over bloodied NATO bots. It is a victory that the Russian military has been rehearsing in reality for the last 3 years, again with the help of Rheinmetall, who helped to build a state-of-the-art laser tag combat training facility, which has been in operation since 2011. So the Crimean operation could be considered as a result of that training, loaded with an enduring sense of unreality enhanced by the invisible armies amassing and dispersing across the horizon, only punctually felt or seen as ominous images of tanks and guns rolling toward the border. What border? Who knows where these images come from, yeah? Accompanied by national neo-folk music, recycled and recirculated again and again, commented with exalted calls of "Hail Russia." Who are these people posting these comments, and what do people actually think? There's really no way of knowing. For one, you can't tell the difference between regular people and fake social network users, between petty ideologues and bots set loose on the web by a shadow army of hacktivists, unofficial shock workers of the SQL injection. By now, machines are posing as anti-American agitators and Russian Orthodox trolls. According to one interview with a Kremlin-loyal hacker, all of the social networks are infiltrated, and there's an artificial 30% inflation to the internet popularity ratings, not only of Putin, but of his entire neo-Stalinist coterie. A third of their likes are made by bots, who are so sophisticated that they can also post comments, and quite complicated ones at that. This has led to unemployment among people who were actually trolling in the 2000s, who now think fondly back to the glory days of cyber war of 2007 against Estonia, 2008 against Georgia, and 2011 against the Russian people, before so many bots were involved. A similar uncertainty affects the colorful characters to emerge from the so-called Russian Spring, the typical people under typical circumstances that so supposedly so fully express all of this reality. Again and again, the suspicion arises that we're dealing with fake users, imprints, reproductions of real people, algorithms that can simulate responses, gestures, exclamations, reproducing subjectivity without enacting it. Real-life people become bots, avatars, or other semi-automatic virtual presences once their images circulate and they turn into memes and folk heroes, rapidly moving consumer goods with a strangely objective stage presence of their own, independent of the original. Such was the case with Nyasha Natasha, or Nyasha the prosecutor, the pretty watery-eyed 33-year-old divorcee Crimean prosecutor who joined the Schmittian gameplay and declared the revolution underway in Kiev to be a fascist coup d'etat, anti-constitutional, and therefore necessitating extraordinary measures to restore order to the Republic of Crimea. The prosecutor looked so insecure and to some sexy in the video that she supposedly appealed to Japanese manga and anime fans. Is it even true, one wonders, or were there Japanese-speaking bots sowing the seeds of a fake bot called I Can't Tell, which was supposedly ricocheted back to Russia, where then 2 pop songs were made in Nyasha Natasha's honor. Let's take a brief look at one of them. So I have to now switch briefly. Whoops. That doesn't do. Something's wrong. This is
Классовой крови привел из предел
So let the men wear the balaclavas. Sexy Nyasha will show you her juridical tricks, and your country too can partake of the New World Order or the lack thereof. The real Natasha Paklonskaya modestly accepts her fame like Anya Chapman, even when she joins the other neo-Stalinist stars on the travel ban list. The bot clicks add up to yet another inflated cult, as you can see here, at 10,000 clicks. I doubt that all of them are real, but maybe, who knows. By now, Natasha Paklonskaya Nyasha has become a paradigm of sorts. Switch back. With all the separatist secessions in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, generating their own sexy ministers of culture or deputy ministers of culture, and there's a whole kind of beauty contest thing going on there, who pose with Crimean champagne on overpasses after the spring rain. The real Nyasha turns out to be a real fascist, especially when she reads an official admonition and threat to the leadership of the Crimean Tatar, 30% minority, who abstained from the rigged annexation ballot and continues to fly Ukrainian flags on their buildings. She keeps reading, I don't think we have time to look at this, but you can find it on the internet. She keeps reading in a monotonous voice as the incensed Tatar leader keeps trying to interrupt her. What looks like a Dadaist performance of simultaneous poetry is actually the first step in the renewed repression of an ethnic minority once already deported and ethnically cleansed. It's where you see how quickly things can get very ugly, even if they involve a pretty girl. There's nothing cute about this new Russian fascism, even if that's how they want us to see it, because that's how we'd like to see things ourselves. Still, never has fascism seemed so soft, so warm, cute, and cuddly. Is it even fascism? Who really knows? There was this moment of doubt when Ukrainian reporters were able to engage an unmarked, polite gentleman in green, clearly of non-Ukrainian and non-European appearance, and thus also emblematic of what still officially promotes itself as an explicitly non-racist, multi-ethnic federal nationalism, albeit with a dark past of conquests and self-colonizations. The Buryat commander in this particular clip, which I'll show a bit of in a few seconds also, confirms all the positive Russian stereotypes toward the colonial subaltern. He is calm, polite, friendly, full of self-irony and deferential almost as he answers the humorless, nearly hysterical questions of the reporters. The real idiot of the clip is the local yokel who comes and accosts the journalists and calls them Nazis and Banderovцы and all these kind of things, but we shrug our shoulders like the Buryat commander. You can't help for such friendly green giants to come and invade your country, should the war ever visit your region. And it's enough to watch maybe the first few seconds just to get an impression. Sorry to be juggling around like this, but one moment. Oh God, I actually see that I don't have it, but you can find it online actually. It's a small glitch, I'm sorry. Okay, I watched this particular clip where you see this very nice gentleman, this truly polite gentleman speaking, and really reveling in the subjective burst of real post-communist kind of awareness under this slick future soldier veneer. I mean, I've seen nothing like it ever before. But again and again, the suspicion arises that actually this video might too be a fake, that the Buryat commander might too be a bot, enacting friendliness for people posing as Ukrainian journalists, but actually in the pay of the Kremlin. So convincing and so reassuring is his image. So the self-image of what we might call Cheburashka fascism as lovable and mild-mannered grew even stronger in yet another presentation of evidence by the Ukrainian secret services. It was they who leaked a photo supposedly proving the presence of the same Russian special ops in Ossetia and Ukraine today. I have to show you the photo. Sorry, this was not the best idea, so keep switching back. You maybe remember these photos that were published in the New York Times. The idiocy of this evidence is so apparent that one cannot help but suspect another false flag operation, since the only common features of these two men is their beards. Still, the picture, intentionally gifted down to the poorest of qualities, made its way to the New York Times, and from there to CNN, the BBC and CNN. Then, much to the pleasure of the Russian media, the poor image came alive. Simon Schuster of Time magazine found one of the gentlemen in the picture. Rather than a Russian special ops, he turned out to be a Kuban Kazakh with the name of a Cossack with a rustic nickname of Grandpa Babai, named after the boogeyman of Russian fairy tales who comes at night and puts disobedient children into his sack. His real name is Alexander Mazhayev. He was in jail during the Chechnya campaign, during the Ossetia campaign, presumably for marijuana trafficking. He sort of admitted to Simon Ostrovsky, the reporter from Vice, right before the latter disappeared for a week in a basement, leading us to wonder whether Mazhayev earned his nickname by kidnapping disobedient OSCE observers and journalists. He's 3 years younger than me. Yeah? He's born in 1977, but he looks like Lev Tolstoy, or like a figure from Gogol or Gorky, or maybe Sholokhov, the quiet Don. But after smoking joints all day, which he also admits to in another interview, his folksy exhortations are so lazy and stoned that the anti-Americanism, Russian Orthodox fundamentalism, and episodic anti-Semitism, one must say, look positively mellow in comparison to anything else out there, watered down by being reproduced so often, again and again, each speech steeped more in cannabis than the last, as the prospects of Russian peacekeepers ending the siege of Slavyansk grows more and more distant. Novorossiya becomes a romantic Confederate stoner's freehold. Babai is Cheburashka. His only true wish is to keep the Americans from knocking on his door, as he says again and again, but ultimately he's too lazy, a broken bot who will eventually retire to the seas of digital oblivion. To the Kremlin, he's probably a welcome ruse to drop the separatists in the end. So here, I have quite a bit more, but I think I'm going to have to sort of cut it down just to say one more thing, in kind of making it shorter. That actually, not all of the heroes, and here we would have to watch it, a clip of how this Babai is stoned and everything and sitting there kind of, oh, I don't really know what to say to you, the journalist. But not all of the heroes of this Crimean excursion and Ukrainian drama are so benevolent and soft. For an example, the two of the main figures, and especially one very scary guy, is this guy called Igor Strelkov, or Girkin, his real name, who is basically the commander of the militia in Slavyansk, and at the same time actually an expert, and a very famous expert in Russia, of military reenactments. So this whole idea that actually the whole thing may be a sort of game, or a dangerous game, is really close by. But it's not a harmless game, of course, because this is somebody who is implicated in, rivers being found floating face down, bodies being found floating face down in the river, and so on. This is the real face of the Russian Freikorps at the moment. Yeah? And he was actually the head of the security service of a very important Russian oligarch, Konstantin Malafeyev, who is, among other things, a minority shareholder of Rostelecom and the initiator and main financier not only of Crimea, but of the League for Internet Safety in Russia. So actually, just to conclude, the final thing that I really want to say is one really could think that this war is not an ordinary war. It's not just about geopolitics. The other space that is trying to be, that is in being contested here is the internet as such, and the main goal is to really build the great firewall of Russia in the end, to keep the situation under control. And we see really symptoms of this. For an example, the new Sputnik state search engine being launched yesterday, or in a couple of weeks, there's supposed to be a launch of a new social network that So these two campaigns sort of go hand in hand, and they fall together with the similar people. The current Prime Minister of the Donetsk People's Republic is the guy who did the publicity for the League of Internet Safety. So one wonders whether this military campaign isn't actually reaching into the internet as much as it's the internet reaching out. So I guess that's all, and thanks for your patience.
So I'm going to try to do two things with my talk, and they might not really go well together, but I'm going to try anyway. I'm going to give a little bit of media theory, media theoretical background or reflection on the theme of circulationism. And I'm also going to try to give a bit of an overview or feel of alternative networks that exist or can exist, or the messiness of networks, I would call it. I'm also going to read it from paper, so I hope you don't mind, and I hope you can follow me. I start off with a quote from the Critical Art Ensemble from 1994, which is from a book you might all want to read if you haven't already, The Electronic Disturbance, in which they basically try to develop strategies to deal with power in the present day of how do you say, vapor type of power that we have to deal with in our lives. So, the dirt and chaos of the muddy media reality that surrounds us does not match the cleanliness of popular visions of both technology and society. Is this a sign of failure? Or is the road towards a utopia or even a dystopia simply unfinished? I argue it is neither, and that instead of this, leaking, friction, distortion, incompatibilities, glitches, obsolescence, and loss are an inherent part of the hybrid technocultural structures that underlie our society. Hybrid networks appear in different shapes. We need to accept their inherent qualities and recognize their potential. In my talk today, I focus on the material basis of present-day networks, a basis that includes the behavior of humans. The process of circulationism, in the sense Hito Steyerl describes, is, in my point of view, an inescapable and logical result of the techno-social environment of the internet. The dizzying visual vortex created by popular sharing cultures and mostly dwindling commercial sites is mostly a surface view of how representation takes shape in new media networks. My view of this matter is influenced by the work of the American media theorists Alexander Galloway and Wendy Chun. Galloway has explored the locus of power and representation in his analysis of networks, games, and software. Chun looks at the inconsistencies between the logic of technology and the ideologies of people. Their work tells us A, that representation has disappeared from view into hybrid and automated processes, and B, networks are by definition leaky, and they couldn't be operational as networks without it. We must learn to see the shape and shaping of representation today, rather than focus on side effects, and we should question societal structures that lead to censorship, violence, and oppression, rather than blame and close the networks. The production of goods, media objects of otherwise, will always produce new discoveries, waste, and failure, as well as take time and energy. The rise of personal media, from pocket photo camera to VHS tapes to laptop and smartphone, multiplied the appearance and experience of the so-called darker qualities of especially media technologies. Situations that used to only appear in, for example, dark rooms, in science labs or editing studios, now pop up in our office, our home, and or in the palm of our hand. The moments where media objects are created, are cut, are directed, deleted, or published have multiplied alongside the production of consumer media products. Classic media objects, be they text, image, or sound-based, are increasingly experienced through handling them, rather than through simply consuming them. Computing is at the heart of this revolution. This change of media experience raises the question whether we maybe need a new perspective on the shape of media objects and on the shape of narrative and art in the expanding media context, which also has started to include physical space, as my colleague David has already mentioned. When audiences become creators and editors, the classic media object no longer reaches them the way it used to. Criticizing the popular concept of remediation, Alex Galloway explains how, rather than remediating a visual language like that of cinema, the computer remediates the very conditions of being itself. Take, for example, the image. Instead of being a thing to just look at and reflect on, in the hand of an active audience, that image is potential raw matter for processing. Even if it is decided to leave the image as is, the experience of the image is still different from what a classic audience experiences. In such a case, the conscious choice is made to not manipulate or interfere with the object. The image, therefore, has become part of a larger process of physical experience and decision-making. It is no longer the central point of representation. Representation, therefore, seems to at least partly escape the screen. It no longer exists in plain view, but rather increasingly manifests itself as an experience, as a campaign or event, and as an appropriation of a variable media space, a space shared through the networks. In new media, sharing is an inevitable part of the creation of representation and memory. In the words of Wendy Chun, behind every act of dead representation are vibrant acts of renewal. Things remain if they become habitually. Unquote. Fragmented, unstable, and seldom produced. Fragmented, unstable, and seldom producing a clear view, representation has dissolved rather than died. It haunts us like a presence of something familiar in the cultural smog of the post-representative state. So these vague media objects we're now dealing with and participatory representational events, which can be just as seductive and manipulative as the simple image, for want of a better word, need not spook us if we understand what they are and how they emerge. Our cultural experience cannot be separated from the hardware and software it is produced and shared through. Hardware in this case does not only refer to computers, but also to cameras, projectors, televisions, printing presses, radio transmitters, smartphones, and so on. The relatively universal machine, the digital computer, which has started to invade all these technological objects in some form or another, is given different purposes and commands through software. In turn, software, code written to perform as an object, as a machine within the machine, has become the invisible force that drives ever larger parts of our human economies and communities. Both hardware and software are produced, however, in such abundance and with such speed that individual machines are obsolete almost the minute they leave the factory. Many of these near-zombie media are products for the consumer market, where a fast change of equipment and tools is the least damaging and most profitable. The result, you can see it above me, is a huge pileup of both e-waste and junk media. This is a market in Indonesia where somebody is trying to find a new motherboard for his computer second-hand. The democratization of media happens through the cheap and fallible devices that flood the streets and homes of the furthest parts of the world. Much like the content they carry, these devices are shared, reused, copied, taken apart and tweaked. The vast spread of especially digital and networked media junk means these devices no longer are at the fringes of the media landscape. Their aesthetic and their drive start to influence the larger network, and they leak into old media, like television, where they first made their entrance as entertainment. It seems that the content and shape of new media networks are intricately bound. High and low quality content mixes as easily as high and low tech. In case of an incompatibility, if it arises, the process towards representation has to find another route, another path through the network. Purely digital networks are rare. Most networks are hybrid and messy, comprised of all the new media, of humans and machines, of technical and social connections. The internet is itself a cluster of such networks, which keeps growing erratically. Sometimes chunks fall off, like off a glacier, to almost magically reconnect later. In the last decade, the metaphor of the rhizome to describe large networks seems to have become romantic and outdated. Topics like stealth surveillance and tracking in social media dominate popular debates about the internet in the post-Snowden era. These meta-issues make the internet appear as a homogeneous, centrally ruled space. We could, however, maybe say the notion of the internet as a thing is a myth. The internet is more like an open invitation to join a basic, though sophisticated, network, but it is not in its entirety a clear-cut structure. The internet is the network of networks. These come in different shapes. There are grey areas, loopholes, and fringes in the network society. Let me give you some examples. So this is the messy internet. The first and simplest and oldest of digital networks is the sneaker net. The probably oldest digital network information is transported from one computer to the next manually. That's also how my presentation got here, by the way. Floppy disks, the retro hipster memory storage of our current digital times, USB sticks, or external hard drives are simply filled with data at one computer, walked, driven, or flown elsewhere, and the data gets uploaded to another computer. This form of network, lovingly called the sneakernet, is still very popular. It is used by people who want to move large amounts of data quickly, or by people who want their information to stay off-grid, away from prying eyes. Hackers and artists have developed a funny take on the sneakernet in recent years, the dead drop. In this sharing method, a USB stick is left in a public space, often cemented into a wall. The stick becomes a drop-off and pick-up spot for data sharers. Initiator of the USB dead drops practice is German artist Aram Bartol, who started cementing USB sticks into walls in Brooklyn during a residency at IBM in New York. The dead drop project may seem like an absurd way to share data or to build a network. The project, however, is part of a growing tendency among media artists and hackers to develop tools and practices that escape commercial network structures and abundant surveillance systems. The examples I'm giving you here today are just a few. The USB dead drop and the sneakernet, in their simplicity and straightforward networking methods, each in their way disclose the essence of sharing, namely generosity and trust. Well, this is a joke on the dead drop dog by the colleagues of Aram Bartol of the Fat Lab. Then there are the wireless hacks and exhibitions. The easiest way to connect many network devices over large distances is through wireless networks. Radio waves are a wonderful way to create network spaces that can move through walls and still closed for intruders. and still be closed for intruders. Wireless technologies have developed rapidly. The smartphone, a telephone and computer in one, quickly transforms public space. Wireless technologies are not just about Wi-Fi networks. They also include GPS, location, and RFID, radio frequency identification chips, which are much used in warehouses, shops, and ID cards. Augmented reality, a way to create a virtual layer over specific locations on the GPS grid, is one. AR creates something in between the hologram and screen-based visualizations. You see an example here. Virtual 3D objects become visible at their designated site, where they are pinpointed through a GPS location, through the use of the camera and the software used to create the object. AR has been used to create guerrilla exhibitions at, for example, the MoMA in New York and the Venice Biennial. The MoMA invasion was organized by Dutch artist Sander Veenhoff and American artist Mark Squarek, and curated through an open call on the internet. Oh, this is the next one already. Science fiction writer Bruce Sterling gave the opening speech also through AR in the entrance hall of the museum, of which he was very proud. Well, more obscure maybe is this example up here, the use of RFID as an exhibition space. Last year, American artist Anthony Antonellis implanted a chip in his hand. The RFID chip sends a weak radio signal. Sorry, I don't know what I'm doing. The RFID chip sends a weak radio signal that can be picked up by mobile phones that are held near the artist's hand. The limited memory space of the chip allows for only one work to be shown at a time. The use of Wi-Fi signals to create independent network spaces, however, offers a much broader range of opportunities. Not only can Wi-Fi signals be connected to create a large network that can cover a country or more, like an independent initiative in Greece 2 years ago showed, Wi-Fi also allows for a kind of experimentation, from building contemporary exhibitions to creating online data interventions. To give you an example of each, Aaron Bartel, again, curated an exhibition called Offline Art in Paris in 2013, in which every artist was represented through a separate Wi-Fi router. You can see the routers hanging on the wall vaguely here in the background. To view each work, the audience had to log in to a different network. Similar exhibition structures are popular in net art circles ever since. Recently, the browser-based group, the study group at the Rietveld Academy in Amsterdam, held an exhibition in the lobby of the school this way. A very different stealth approach to spreading your data was demonstrated in a work by the American artists Ethan Ham and Ethan Miller, in a work they called The Virtual State of Jefferson. The work is an ironic and suggestive commentary on the desire of residents of the county of Jefferson to form a separate 51st state of the USA, the state of Jefferson. What happened was that they used the possibility to program routers to intervene in the data stream of people who use the wireless network of the router. And by doing so, they replaced all location searches in Google done through the router with, so every location search was replaced with Jefferson. So all results you would get back, all the cities and country, everything was Jefferson. It's a similar work to Moose Tweak, a project by Danya Vasiliev and Julian Oliver, which won the Ars Electronica Award a few years ago, and which also reveals the vulnerabilities and possibilities with digital media many of us are not aware of. Yet I'm just going to race through this. So encryption and re-decentralization are important aspects. Oh, this is also a catalog in the shape of a Wi-Fi network. You put batteries in and you read the catalog through the Wi-Fi network, also by Vasiliev and Oliver. So the indie web movement and the Guardian project. There's lots of software projects that develop all kinds of encryption and safe softwares for you to use social media. I'm going to do this really quickly now to just get over it. For instance, this is the indie web project. This one I find a little bit more interesting. It's the Guardian project. A group of hackers and engineers who develop tools for us to browse privately, to have secure messaging. You can download their Chat Secure app and even have a secure chat on Facebook, for example. But apart from an alternative software movement, there is since a few years also an alternative hardware network movement. Like with software, this movement consists of various groups of individuals with as many different approaches. The most ambitious one can be found in Germany. The German hacker movement is very strong and very innovative, and they started a space program about 3 years ago. They did so not so much because they want to fly to Mars, but because they are looking into ways to develop a completely new, independent internet with the use of satellites. As they put it, the hacker community needs a fallback infrastructure in case of natural and economic disaster to stay connected. Though this seems like a wild plan, satellite technology has become a lot more accessible in recent years. The development of the smartphone has also changed the world of space exploration. NASA launched miniature satellites in spring 2013 that were constructed around the HTC Nexus 1 Android phones. The unmodified phones operate as the brains of NASA's 10 centimeter cubed CubeSat constructed from commercial off-the-shelf components. Each satellite costs between $3,500 and $7,000 to build. Not much later, several companies in the Silicon Valley have launched their own mini satellites and even offer rent space on it for $250 a week. Getting a satellite into orbit and renting one for a reasonable price should soon be quite easy. To create an alternative communication network, however, takes more than having one's own satellite. On March 3rd of this year, a call went out via YouTube to collaborate on building a network of ground stations for this hacker-independent network. The organizers envision ground stations to be based in back gardens and on balconies. The project is still in an experimental phase, but it shows how the ambition and know-how to build independent networks does exist. Paraphrasing the words of Mary Chun, anxiety over surveillance and commodification and hope for empowerment complement rather than oppose each other. So this is Galloway's book. This is Wendy Chun. Exposure and leakage are necessary aspects for networks to work. Power over representation today exists within the structure and experience of media, more than it does in the visual products of it. In his book, The Interface Effect, Alexander Galloway calls for a new form of visualization, one that reveals the important political and cultural objects and events in the network society, rather than just hovers on the surface. And I think circulationism is a way to trick us, a way to hypnotize us and stay on the surface. In the words of the Critical Art Ensemble, one should seek an aesthetics of confusion that reveals potential choices, thus collapsing the bourgeois aesthetic of efficiency. Learning to see beyond the surface might achieve just that. Thank you.
I think, well, I mean, while you're still hopefully busy trying to formulate questions, I can just start with the first one by trying to link both presentations. It's not really a question, it's just an observation, I think, on what level they link, because it's interesting to see how in both examples, I mean, first of all, there's of course a link between, let's say, internet reality, but also physical reality, and this link is in both cases quite unpredictable. You don't really know what's happening. And the difference is that you, David, have shown us a sphere in which, let's say, the confusion of a zone in which the link between what is represented and structural base, its material base, is no longer clear. This is being exploited by, you know, the powers that be to create new divisions, to shut off the internet, to create basically new networks that are nationalist. And you, Josephine, on the other hand, emphasize, let's say, the potential that still lies in this zone of confusion to create other networks which are horizontal, self-organized, but also, let's say, independent, autonomous. So this is a very interesting juxtaposition, I think, is to describe this same zone of, basically raw contestations of forces, of technologies, of material constellations. On the one hand, as something which, I mean, let's face it, is really being used by nationalists and also by corporations, by big corporate or big corporations or nations to basically gain power, to colonize and invade, and to create basically new geopolitical spaces. On the other hand, it is still an area where new things can emerge and which can be used for horizontal communication, and also, more importantly, the rewiring of networks, or the alternate or parallel wiring of networks that runs across, let's say, corporate platforms. I'm not saying the network, I'm not saying the infrastructure, but platforms. So maybe someone has a question in the meantime, which I would be very happy to take, because I don't want to take away time from the Q&A. I'm going to wait now. You don't have a chance.
Can I ask a question today?
Sure, yeah.
In the beginning of your talk, you spoke of, you said something of how people expected the network to be a safe haven. What did you mean by that?
The thing is that we're talking about a society. I mean, the situation in Russia. Maybe it's like it was increasingly, or actually, I would say since maybe 6, 7, 8 years, Russia has been a one-party state again. It's been a country basically without a public sphere, the kind that one was sort of in wishful thinking, kind of praying that would emerge in the post-perestroika period, never emerged. Instead, any kind of public sphere was basically privatized and became a place of consumption. And the only space where one could articulate oneself, TV is completely state-controlled, radio is completely state-controlled, the newspapers are completely state-controlled. So the only place that was really a kind of, let's say, a personalizable space of consumption, where at the same time there was an illusion of political articulation, or the possibility for the articulation of political subjectivity. And I think that there's also, you also have to think that you also have to see it in a much more infrastructurally precarious situation than here. For an example, where the only thing that works is almost your device. Like everything else, all other infrastructures are very faulty, but you're walking around with this device that makes you think you're Flash Gordon. I mean, that's really the upshot of that safe haven idea. It's the one space that seems to be somehow immune or beyond what's going on in reality, or at least it seemed that way. So you have people like the former intelligentsia in Moscow who are completely just Facebook addicts and who only live there, and who don't really engage anymore with they don't take the train, they don't take the metro, they're just on Facebook. That's really where they live. So that's what I meant. But just to say one thing about Hito's comment about the gray zone. On the one hand, it's being instrumentalized. I think these two things go hand in hand, because what the Russian state, for an example, was really good at, and what the Americans haven't learned to do yet, for example, is to instrumentalize, hackers, hacktivists, criminals, big time cyber criminals to actually work for the state. So the shadow army that has been emerging is on the one hand, emerging from the possibilities that you and Hito were mentioning. China has been doing that as well. So that's actually the most dangerous place, is where it's the the technological equivalent of the capture of cultural criticality by a hegemonic art world, I would say. That's also an interesting aspect. Because you have people who are resistant somehow to the system developing something, but the system is immediately sucking it up and deputizing them.
I'm asking the question again. Now I'm asking the questions to the audience. Because, as I said, I don't think any of this is none of what was said or none of what could be said is a privileged point of view. I think at this moment things are so much happening, that basically whatever contribution or observation there is contributing to knowing more about it, because the more perspective we have on what's going on, the more types of description, the more, I think, the easier it is to develop a common discussion about it. And I think, as both examples have strongly suggested, it's necessary because the consequences are quite dramatic.
I have a question.
Yes.
David, is this working? Yeah. I think I know the answer to this, but I'd quite like you to articulate it in terms of, one thing that was very clear in your talk was you not being able to understand what was fake, what was phony, what was controlled, self-organized, but in terms of kind of propaganda or state control within Russia, if you could just put this into some sort of historical context. What does this mean in terms of this inarticulation of what is real, what is phony, what is self-organized within Russia's recent or even 20th century history?
Yeah, I think the 20th century history is probably familiar to a lot of people, but from the wrong side, so that the entire Soviet project would seem like one big simulation. That actually isn't the case, and the zone, there's a similar kind of gray zone between real socialism as a kind of fake, complete, the perfect, concentrated spectacle, and real socialism as a reality, and as also a reality that did actually empower, maybe enfranchise some people. Yeah? But you had a situation of, on the one hand, of a very strong censorship, a very strong state control of media, but of very highly developed communities and grassroots networks of informal. The Dead Drop project actually sort of reminds me of some of that aesthetic, but in another age. Where you have dead drops of manuscripts and networks of intellectuals exchanging. I don't know, the Solzhenitsyn and so on. Right. So, but this, the cultural version of that in the Cold War era, in the Soviet era, was really the establishment of informal networks of a kind of alternate public sphere. Today in Russia, there's, I think in the last 20 years, the terms of that have shifted quite a bit. And there's one thing, this undecidability of is it fake, is it real, is it a seamless simulation or what's going on, I think are enhanced by the fact that all of the Putin regime's image makers are fans of the Matrix, that they're all into Baudrillard, and they received him, and their intellectual development also stopped when they received him in the early to mid 90s. So someone like Konstantin Ernst, who is the head of the TV channel, actually the main TV, the state TV channel, actually has published a book about the Matrix, with essays from Russian translations of essays by Zizek and so on. And so you had this kind of enthusiasm for a kind of postmodernist, is it real, is it unreal thing going on there. And at the same time, these are the people who are really reenacting the Soviet total spectacle, concentrated spectacle, total control of the public sphere. So it does create a very ominous situation. But I think that in many ways, a lot of people who remember the Soviet experience, said things were never as bad as they are now. You know, even in the late 70s, when the Afghanistan war had just started, and things really turned to shit, you know, very quickly. But things were not as hardcore as they are now. The kind of censorship, the kind of blatant lying also that the regime is doing. When Putin said, you know, I mean, you all heard this over the last week. He said 3 times, the troops are going from the border, but they're still there. And then they're going again from the border, they're still there. You know, this kind of, this way of working is something qualitatively new, and I think it has to do with the kind of understanding of how this big simulation works. It's a warped understanding, but it is an understanding.
It feels like you're exaggerating a little bit. You know, I'm thinking of the Stalin era here. It doesn't seem to me like we're in the worst of times for communist Russia right now.
No, I didn't mean the Stalin era. I meant the Soviet era in recent memory, especially the late Soviet era. The Stalin era is a different story, and I think, but there too, you would be surprised how many loopholes there are, and so on. I mean, that's something that has to be a bit more reflected and understood, how differentiated that time was as well. I think the black and white image of kind of like there was this, you know, a hardcore total. Yes, there was, but it also had its own. Yes.
No, but I think that what this example seems to illustrate quite clearly is the emergence, and I personally think that, you know, or basically in brick locations, there's the developments really are an avant-garde, no? In relation to new, let's say, consensus-oriented authoritarian paradigms that are heavily mediated. I mean, not only by television, but also by news and all of that. So this is emerging, this is interesting to see, you know, how these paradigms are emerging also in relation to earlier paradigms. You mentioned, for example, in the discussion, the debate around re-education and how this is supposed to work through the figure of the prosecutor. And so, anyhow, I think this is where a part of potential future is, and this is why I think it's extremely interesting to see, because this is, again, you know, I mean, to come back to my idea of the code without contract, or there is one, you know, sign, but you don't really know, and anyone can understand it from their point of view. I think this is precisely describing this zone of opaque representation of where something is, you know, you see something, but you have no idea what it is, where it comes from, who produces it, and from what intent, and also it could mean it could flip around completely. So this zone of, well, cultural smog, as you call it, or post-representation, or just the gray zone, this was also another term used, is where things are emerging that can turn out to be very, well, totalitarian on the one hand, but also still containing seeds of possibility. This is how I would summarize this discussion. And so we will take a break now.